All right, maybe I could have your attention, please. Before I begin my lecture today, as I've always done, I want to give you an opportunity to ask some questions. I also want to tell you that I just made up your final exam, and I want to remind you what the format of the exam is and what you should do to prepare for the exam, which will be handed out to you at the end of class on Thursday. It's going to be due on June 11th, so you have 1 week to write the exam, which it seems to me is a pretty adequate period of time. You're going to be given 6 questions, going to be divided into 3 groups of 2 questions each, and you'll answer a total of 4 out of 6 questions, so you have a fair bit of choice. In group 1, you do not have any choice, so you have 2 questions in group 1, and you're going to answer both of those questions. And then group 3, you have 2 questions, you answer 1. And then group 4, you have 2 questions, and again, you answer 1. So you answer a total of 4 out of 6. The instructions you get are going to give you very clear guidelines about how to write the exam, you know, what font to use, but it's Times New Roman 12, how many pages? Roughly 2 to 3 pages per question. Okay, so your exam should be somewhere between 8 and 12 pages. If somebody here is really, really inspired and you want to write 15, 20 pages, be my guest. You may do that by all means, but I think that 3 pages is more than enough to give an adequate answer to any one of the questions that you have on the exam. There are no ID questions, nothing of that sort. So basically, each question counts for 25% of the grade, right? They're all essay questions. It's a take-home, open book exam. You can consult any number of books. But in my view, the best way to prepare for this exam is not to worry about outside sources. Just make sure you've done all the readings for this class. Of course, when you get the exam, you'll be able to figure out which readings are going to be the most useful, right? Because it is an open book take-home exam. And therefore, if you find that you haven't done a particular reading and you think it's actually not particularly useful for answering any of the 4 questions that you want to answer, you obviously can decide to omit that reading, right? But I'm saying that if you were thinking about preparing for it right now, you probably need to make sure that you've done the readings and have attended the lectures. And if you haven't come to class regularly, then you certainly should either borrow someone's class notes or go to the website bruincast, right, .ucla.edu, and either listen to the podcasts or look at the videos, right? But you should be able to get the entire text of the lecture. The only thing you do not get in the podcast, I believe, is you do not get the exchange that takes place because the microphone is on me. So if somebody is asking a question from the back of the room, you're not going to hear the question, I believe, if that's the case. And so therefore, you might not have the context for the answer. Okay? Any questions about that? Any points of clarification? The exams will be due in my office between 10 and 11 a.m. on June 11th. Email submissions cannot be accepted because I'm going to have to print it out if you send me an email. So you do have to give me a printed copy of the exam. Okay? Natalie, I think you had a question. About the content. Yeah, widow immolation. Sorry? Widow immolation. Sati. Yeah. Widow immolation. Yeah. What do you want to know about it?
I just want to know if it's more about caste or more about class.
More about caste or class? I'm not sure that caste or class are the predominant issues there. Nothing is not about caste or class in India, if I may put it to you this way. But in this case, it is definitely about patriarchy and gender. There may be economic issues involved, right? Because how and why and under what circumstances sati takes place is something that would have to be assessed on a case-to-case basis. But sati is not what you really need to be concerned about, because sati was largely a colonial phenomenon, right? It took place in the colonial period. I mean, in independent India, nobody has really done, I would say, a exact count of how many satis have taken place. But you're talking about maybe 100, 150 satis or something of that kind in the last 60 years. So it's dowry murder, which is what we had discussed at very considerable length, right? Bride burning, not really sati cases. So I wouldn't worry too much about sati. Yeah. Yes.
You said turn the channel Thursday between 10 and 11. If we're leaving before then, can we put it in your box?
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah. I mean, yeah, don't worry about that. I mean, you can always turn it in much earlier if you want, but not by email. You still have to give a printed copy, right? So you slip it under the door, but you'll get all of these instructions. Believe me, the instructions are absolutely crystal clear. You know, where to turn it in, what my office number is for those of you who have not been to my office, and you know, if you don't want to slip it under the door, you want to give it to the history department, you can do that. It's all mentioned in the guidelines that you have. Yeah. Question? No, I've answered it. Okay. All right. So before I begin the lecture, what kind of questions do you think you would get? I mean, is anybody here? In other words, I mean, one of the things that you have to think about is you have to think about the big issues, right? I mean, because that's what we've really, in a sense, concentrated on. I mean, I'm not going to ask you a question on the final exam, which is going to say, give me the number of sati or dowry murders that have taken place in Delhi and explain why the number has gone from 2,000 to 5,000 or 5,000 to 4,000, right? I'm not going to get anything of that kind, obviously. I mean, there are very large issues that we've talked about. We've talked about democracy in India, right? What have been the circumstances under which democracy has taken place in India, and why the question persists. And I think it will persist for another few decades to come, given the nature of the Indian subcontinent and given what's happening in the countries around India. I mean, Pakistan and Afghanistan don't exactly look like they're headed towards real democratic futures, at least at this point in time. Okay? So the question really is, why is it that somehow the democratic experiment was able to persist in India, right, after independence, when in other countries that were formerly under colonial rule and that then became decolonized, in those countries, democracy, for the most part, did not really flourish, right? I mean, if you take about 70 or 80 countries around the world that acquired independence from in the aftermath of World War II, so from 1945 all the way till the early 1960s, right? I mean, there are very few countries where the experiment in democracy can be said to have succeeded to some degree, right? And I've never made the claim, as you know only too well, that the experiment in democracy has been spectacularly successful in India. But of course, my claim is that it's not spectacularly successful even in the US, for that matter, right? So I think that certainly if you look at India, I think if you look at it in comparison not just to Pakistan and Afghanistan, but if you look at it in comparison to countries such as Algeria, which fought a war of independence, there's no question in my mind that in India democracy did persist. So we had a discussion on that, right? So I think that when you start preparing for the exam, I think you need to think about some of the kinds of big issues that we've talked about here. Hindu-Muslim relations. How does one understand Hindu-Muslim relations in India? What has been the history of such relationships? What are the various forms that they take, right? So forth and so on, right? And if you get a chance to review your notes before class on Thursday, then by all means, we can begin Thursday morning with questions that you might have. All right? Any queries at all? Yes.
Just to kind of clarify the format of the exam, so there's
Yeah.
going to be 4 questions that we pick out of the 6. Do you want us to integrate them all into one essay, or do you want
No. There's no way you can integrate them into one essay. I mean, so each question you write an answer, and then when you finish an answer, then you move on to the next question. Yeah, yeah, right. But each question is a short essay by itself, right? Each answer will be a short essay by itself. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Joe, I just want to know the main objective for our essay is to show that we understand the issues more than how we interpret it, right? How we see the issues.
Well, I think that would be a safe way to put it, but there'll be some places where you will have to do the work of interpretation. In order for you to show that you understand the issues, you're going to have to interpret the question, right? Yeah.
But how?
You're not expected to get into a level of interpretation which is, beyond anything that you have encountered either in class or in the readings. right? So, you know, for example, Adiga, white tiger. So you remember that when I handed out the papers to you two and a half weeks ago, I said that, look, I mean, okay, so there's this metaphor of light and dark, right? The darkness and light, right? So I said, where does Adiga get it from? You know, how come nobody actually even speculated? Now, when I say speculate is the right word, I'm not expecting, so I just gave you an illustration. I said, okay, where in Western culture do you first find this metaphor at work, right? And then I suggested to you that you find it at work in Genesis 1, right? But I'm not expecting you to either know Genesis 1 or cite Genesis 1. Of course not. That was simply an illustration to show you that a writer, a creative writer, pulls things out of somewhere. They don't come from just nowhere, right? Right? In your answers, you basically have to just confine yourself to the material that you have in this course. And that means the lectures and the readings. Yeah. And if you do that, you're on pretty safe ground. Provided, of course, you've understood the material. I mean, if you haven't understood the material, then we have a different set of issues. But if you've understood the material, then... So, you know, if I said, okay, so let me ask you, let's just make sure that we understand what's going on here. What is communalism? Supposing you got hypothetically a question called, what is communalism and what is the communalist interpretation of Indian history, right? How would you answer it? Anybody? Anna.
So I guess the violence between religious groups, the division of people within India according to religious terms, so Muslims versus Hindu. And so Hindu nationalists would view Indian history, a Muslim Hindu viewing Indian history in terms of communalism would believe that they've been always ruled by outside forces, such as like the Muslims in India. So they wouldn't see those people as Indians, but rather outsiders coming in.
Okay. Okay. You're on track. You're on track. But there are elements of it that are on track. But somehow I would suggest that in the answer, you've sort of begun midstream, if I may put it this way. That is that you've begun in the middle somewhere. So the middle here is, okay, so communalism has to do with sort of a Hindu nationalist view, right? Hindu nationalist view of Muslims, and Muslims are still seen as outsiders and as foreigners, right? That's pretty much approximates what you said, I think, in a nutshell. Okay.
But I mean, I didn't say that it begun there, but
No. You didn't say that began there, but in saying that, I'm saying that your answer actually begins halfway in the middle. What do you begin with when you start talking about communalism? Yeah.
Colonial device to divide.
Okay. Number one, colonialism had an impact on how we understand Hindu-Muslim relationships, right? Okay. And what was a colonial strategy? The colonial strategy was a strategy of rule and divide. Okay. Right? And by the way, I mean, if you start doing very, very subtle work, then, you know, at a very advanced level, then one runs into all kinds of questions about, well, to what extent was that really the case? Did they really do it in so overt a manner? Was it done much more subtly? But we don't need to worry about that, right? Because we're not here doing a course where we're looking at, you know, all the subtle methods that might have been used to create divisions amongst the Indians, right? But as a general proposition, yes, the first element that we would look at, we would say that, well, Hindu-Muslim relations, the understanding of Hindu-Muslim relations in India has been largely determined, down to the present day, by the colonial context and by colonialism, right? And one of the things that happened in the colonial period, which is a period when the British ruled India, that the British created a rule and divide policy, which means in part that one of the things they did was they created a kind of an interpretive framework. They created an interpretive framework so that when you look back at the Indian past, they said that Hindus and Muslims have always been separated, right? That's the beginning of communalism, right? And then what's the other major thing that you need in order to look at communalism? You need some, Nikhil?
Is it important to discuss how the Hindu nationalists were ostracized
I wouldn't say that in 2.5 pages that would probably be something that you'd have to put down. No, because it's certainly true. What you're saying is true, that after Mohandas Gandhi was assassinated in January 1948, the Indian government put a ban, placed a ban on the RSS, which is a Hindu nationalist organization, right? And that they have emerged in recent years. But communalism has been around for a long period of time. That's why we go back to the colonial period, right? We go back to the colonial period and say that, well, communalism has to do with how one understands the relationship between Hindus and Muslims. It could be, by the way, Hindus and Sikhs as well. So we're saying religious communities, but we're here, you pick an illustration, the illustration would be Hindu-Muslim communities, okay? But the other major component you need is identity, right? Communalism has to do with the question of identity. That in all countries, I'll get you in a second, Natalie. In all societies, the question of identity is a crucial question. The question is, how do we think about identity? The communalist view of Indian history states that in India, more so than in any other place, religion is the basis of a person's identity. So before Vinay Lal is a male, and before he is a professor, and before he is an Indian, he is a Hindu, right? According to the communalist view, right? So everybody in India, the predominant form of identity for them, according to the communalist view, is religion. And then people of a similar religion band together. That's how collectivities come together, right? So that, you know, for example, if I said, oh, you know, I pick my friends depending on what their political interests and what their intellectual interests are, the communalist view would say, no, Vinay Lal picks his friends depending on whether they're Hindus or not. I am simplifying it a bit, but you see what I mean. That according to the communalist view, people of a shared religious identity will band together, form a collectivity, and then you get these blocks called Hindus and Muslims. And the communalist interpretation of Indian history then states that these Muslims and Hindus, because they embrace vastly different ideologies and theologies, right? Such as the fact that the Muslims have a book called the Quran, the Hindus have multiple books, right? The Hindus may not, obviously do not believe in the idea of the Prophet being, right, the ultimate, so forth and so on, right? If you see what I mean, right? So we would say that this is how you get to the communalist view. So once a communalist view has been established, then it begins to have consequences in real life. It begins to have consequences in real life because people make political alignments according to the communalist view, depending on what their religion is, right? And then in the last phase of it, and this is where, Nikhil, your comment sort of comes in a way, right? Although if you were giving, I mean, if you were writing a book on it, then I think that comment would really have to come in. But in a short answer, it probably will not. But where it could possibly come in would be that communalism then enters into the public life of the country, right? It enters into the public life of the country, and communalism can lead, or the communalist interpretation can lead to violent religious conflict, right? But the other thing about the communalist interpretation and communalism is the fact that communalism, because it persists in seeing things in religious categories, it may not be seeing the conflict through other lenses that are more valuable, right? So for example, let's supposing in the Times of India, right, which is a major Indian newspaper published as a daily, right, in English. So in the Times of India, you saw, let's say on page 5, day before yesterday, a little news item, and a little news item says, group of Hindu peasants killed, okay, or group of Muslim peasants killed in the village, right, of Barabanki in UP. UP is Uttar Pradesh. Right? Now you read this little news item and you say, this is definitely a communal conflict, right? Because the news item says 5 Hindu peasants killed, or 5 Muslim peasants killed. More likely, by the way, that there would be Muslims here in this case, simply because the landless laborers, well, there are tons of Hindu landless laborers as well. But supposing it were in fact actually a conflict that was a class conflict, not simply a religious conflict. Right? That is, that the peasants get into a dispute with the money lender in the village or the landholder in that village, the guy who actually owns the land on which they're working as landless laborers. Now, you could say, if you really did a detailed analysis of that incident, let's supposing you were an investigative journalist and you went out and you did a detailed investigation, you find out it's actually a class conflict. Right? These are landless laborers. They've been exploited by their landlord. The landlord happens to be a Hindu. These peasants happen to be Muslims. When it gets reported as a Hindu-Muslim conflict. But in fact, it is a class conflict. Right? That's what communalist interpretation of Indian history does. That's what communalism does. It forces you to look at Indian society and the phenomenon in Indian society predominantly through the lens of religion. Right? That's how you would answer the question if you got a question of that kind. Right? Okay, so this is what I would suggest that, as I said, review your notes and just look at the general kind of, what are some of the big issues that we've really talked about, because I think that will be the most helpful way to prepare for the exam. Yes?
Last question. In each essay, how do you see citation? It is a must?
It's mentioned in the instructions. No. You need to refer to texts. I mean, you can't write 10 pages and not give references to the readings. Yeah. I mean, if you get a question which calls for some kind of economic analysis of what's happened in India, just hypothetically, you have to be able to cite, either Amartya Sen or Arundhati Roy or some reading or the other. Yeah. You can't just write from the top of your, head, if so to speak, right? You have to give citations. Yeah. And the instructions will tell you how to give the citations. Yeah.
How important is before independence and Gandhi and everything like that?
Not really. No, because that's not part of the subject of this. I mean, the Gandhi is important only because he's assassinated. So the assassination is important, and we talked about that at quite some length. That obviously is part of the syllabus of the class. But you're not expected to know what Gandhi did in the 1920s and 1930s. That's not part of the syllabus. Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me move on to the last week's lectures. Okay. And what I want to do is I want to try to get to all of these subjects today. If I don't, then I'll get to some of them on Thursday. Globalization, the bomb. You've actually read two pieces on the bomb. One is by Amartya Sen, and one is by myself. And when I say the bomb here, I'm referring obviously to India's nuclear tests, which were followed in very quick succession by tests undertaken by Pakistan, right? And what the rest of it is, we will get to that later on if we have time today. Let me begin with the question of globalization. But before I do that, let me preface my remarks by saying what is it that we're trying to do in this last week. Okay? So what we're trying to do is the following. That I think that up till this point in time, you've had a pretty broad and in some respects detailed overview, okay, of where India and to some extent, to a marginal extent, where the rest of South Asia is, okay, in today in the world, and what has been the nature of the history of that region in the last 60 years since independence of India and the creation of Pakistan in 1947. Right. So we've looked at obviously politics to some degree, and we've looked at the nature of political participation. One of the things that's changed in India is a greater percentage of the people have entered into, okay, the public life of the nation. In fact, this change is a change that in some ways has been taking place since the late 18th century, because the real significance, in a sense, of the French Revolution was the bringing of the masses into politics, right? Bringing of the masses into politics. So the masses enter into history in a certain way in the late 18th century, early part of the 19th century, and of course in the period when India was under colonial rule, and particularly in the first part of the 20th century, when Gandhi led the Indian National Congress in resistance to British rule. We saw the entry of masses at that time as well, right? But in a way, once independence is accomplished, once the British have been thrown out of India, right? Okay, in 1947, then in effect you find that there is, if I may put it this way, a kind of a retreat of the masses, right? And the only way in which the masses are really present in the life of the nation is through the electoral ballot,
Right? And so one of the significant things that we saw in the 1970s was the beginning of these mass movements. You remember that the movement I described, led by Jayaprakash Narayan, in opposition to the emergency that had been placed by Indira Gandhi, and something that is discussed in the Menon Aditya Nigam book as well. Okay? Right? So it's the entry of the masses. And now I'm suggesting to you that this is really, you're seeing a full-blown form of that, not simply through the electoral ballot, but you're seeing it in various kinds of grassroots movements, right, ecological movements. The Narmada Bachao Andolan would be certainly an illustration of that. Okay, so political changes, we've tracked those. We've looked at what might be some of the economic issues, and I've also looked at the realm of culture. Right? So what we're trying to do now at this juncture is to say, all right, so where is India situated today in the world? Okay, what are the prospects for democracy in India? To what extent does India fit the narrative of globalization that we are hearing a lot about in the course of the last decade or two, right? And what is the future of India, right? Is India going to become a carbon copy of the West? In other words, all right, so, you know, perhaps more and more people will eventually be lifted out of poverty, right? Of course, you're not going to get, the likelihood is that for 1.1 billion people, you are not going to be able to get a pretty high standard of living for the entire population of India, no matter what kind of growth you have, right? But one of the things that we need to think about is it simply the case that India, okay, needs to catch up with the West, okay, and that, you know, we need to continue to lift people out of poverty? I think that most people would agree that that is a desirable objective, the second one, namely lifting people out of poverty. But it may be that we have to think of a world, okay, where people in the West have to perhaps lower their levels of affluence a bit. Okay? And when I say the West here, I don't mean only the United States, obviously. I mean Japan, Canada, New Zealand, you know, Western Europe, you know, the highly affluent countries for the most part, Switzerland, etc., that, you know, this is the debate in a way that took place between two figures that I've talked to you about before, okay, and let me mention them again in a different context now, okay, and those are Ambedkar and Gandhi. Gandhi you all know. Ambedkar, for those of you who have already forgotten, let me refresh your memory, right, that he is the principal leader of the Dalits and the framer of the Constitution of India, the principal framer, not the only one, because there was a committee, right, that was created to draft the Constitution for India. And in the 1920s and 1930s, Gandhi and Ambedkar had a bitter conflict over the question of electorates, separate electorates for Dalits, or the question basically of representations for the Dalits. You know, how does one actually advance the position of the Dalits, given that these people have been subjected to discrimination over a really long sustained period of time, right? And if I had to capture it in a nutshell, and you'll see where this comment now fits in with what I'm talking about, Ambedkar, I might say, represents the kind of view that we are all familiar with. And the view is that the way to achieve equality, because the real question here has to do with how does one achieve equality in this world, right? Not just within India, but let's supposing that, you know, people were lifted out of poverty, a greater number of people were lifted out of poverty in India, and as I said, we'll never reach those levels of affluence that most people have in the West, right? And there is a question as to whether those levels of affluence can in fact persist in the West for much longer. That's a question that has been posed as well. But let's assume that they will persist for some time to come. The question is, what is the way in which one achieves equality, not only between Indians within India, but between nation states? Right? I mean, there's an enormous gap between nation states at the bottom and the nation states at the top. Okay? Now, Ambedkar's view then is a view that what you need to do is you need to lift people upwards. And of course, Gandhi agrees with that. But Gandhi also thinks that some people have to be brought down. That doesn't sound very nice, perhaps, right? But when I say that some people have to be brought down, what it means is that you cannot sustain a world, okay, where the levels of affluence that people have enjoyed in the Western countries, right, and a few other countries such as Japan, you cannot sustain these levels of affluence, okay, if you wanted to be able to have these levels of affluence spread through very large populations. Right? In 1930, Gandhi made an extraordinary remark. Right? So he was, he had gone to London, which was going to be his last visit to the United Kingdom for the Roundtable Conference. Right? And one of the remarks that he made at that point was, he said that if a small island such as England had to exploit a huge country like India in order to give its people a certain standard of living, imagine the levels of exploitation that would be required in order to give the people of India, right, not to mention China, the same standards of living. Right? Think of it this way. Right? So this is what I'm saying, that we have to think about this, and when we locate India within globalization, the question now is, is the future of India simply going to be, it's going to become a miniature United States or a miniature Europe of some kind, right, where, you basically have a model of expansion and growth to whatever extent it's possible to have it, right? And obviously the nature of societal relationships is very different, okay, in these countries than it is in a country like India. Or will India chart its own path in some sense of the term, right? So before we answer that question, I think we need to say, what is globalization, right? So does anybody want to entertain, especially those of you who are in development studies, right? I mean, I assume that this word is cropping up in your literature almost every day. What is globalization? Anjana?
The movement is the transfer of goods and services across borders.
Okay. A movement or transfer of
Services and goods,
services and goods across borders.
but not limited. Also like ideologies or like ideas.
Okay. But tell me this then. Do you think globalization is a recent phenomenon in human history, or is it been around for a long period of time? I mean, how does the literature discuss it?
I think like with the advancement of different technologies, it's become to a higher degree.
Accelerated. Accelerated, right? So the prevalence of modern technologies has made the transfer of goods and services, okay, faster, easier, right? Okay. Anything else that anybody would like to add? So you think that? So would I be correct in understanding you as saying that globalization may have been around before, perhaps we didn't call it that, but there is a difference between the transfer of goods and services, let's say, in the 16th century as opposed to now, because now this transfer of goods and services is taking place at a highly accelerated rate using all the paraphernalia of modern technology, right? Would that be an accurate way of summarizing, right, what you're saying? Okay. All right. Yeah.
Could it be seen as interaction and communication between people around the globe become faster and more frequent?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that, because I mean that's one of the things that internet allows you to do. Skype, you can just have a Skype account, and you could be calling, Guatemala or Mexico or India or whatever it is, and talk on Skype, right? Yeah, but I mean, there's no question that all of this would be true, that communication is faster. Of course, I'm tempted to say what Henry David Thoreau said in 1845 when the telegraph line came to Boston and Concord, and all the papers were shouting themselves hoarse, saying, "Hey, the telegraph line has come! What a great thing!" And Thoreau said, "Yeah, but does anybody have anything really interesting to say to anybody else? Right? I mean, 99% of the conversations that are taking place are absolute gibberish, anyhow, right? So what difference does it really make if you're having huge amounts of conversation, right? I mean, I just read a article in the New York Times." Which said that an average American teenager sends 4,000 SMS messages a month. I said, 4,000? I couldn't send that in 10 lifetimes. I mean, I have no. What do they have to say to each other? I mean, I'm sure I know what it is. You go to the mall and you SMS your friend. Hey, what color shoes should I buy? What shape or whatever it is that people SMS about. But I mean, that's not conversation, right? From my standpoint, right? I mean, you're not going to increase the level of human thinking and morality through any of these kinds of conversations, that's for sure. Okay? So when we say that, yes, the internet has come in, right, and it's accelerated the rate of conversations and so on, but the question would have to do with
what is the nature of the qualitative change that is taking place, right? Okay, so I'm going to try to see if we can add a few other things. I'm keeping both of you in mind. Just give me a second. Just let me finish my train of thought. So, there's this New York Times columnist who, by the way, has been extremely enthusiastic about India. That was not how he was 15 years ago. Thomas Friedman, I'm sure that some of you have read a few of his columns. So he wrote this book called The World is Flat. It's certainly a flat read, if you ask me. But he does have this argument that, yes, that things are becoming more level. There is a level playing field, and one of the things that is facilitating that is globalization. So now, the markets, it's not simply the presence of markets everywhere, but that, the flows maybe are no longer unidirectional, they're multidirectional, not just bidirectional, they're multidirectional, okay? So when we look at, for example, pop culture, right? It's no longer the case, really, that the only kind of predominant pop culture is American in origin. I mean, the Japanese pop culture has reached all corners of the world. These manga comics, I don't know how many of you here know manga, they're even coming out in English now. I lived in Japan, so I've been familiar with them for 40 years, since the time I lived there as a very young boy. Right? And, manga is extremely popular in many parts of Southeast Asia, has reached, obviously, various kinds of diasporic locations. And we know Nintendo, I've got a boy, so I know quite a lot about these Japanese pop culture, if I may put it this way, which has now become kind of ubiquitous, if I may put it this way, right? Okay, so someone would come along and say, well, that is an aspect of globalization, right? So we've got transfer of goods and services, right? The service is, for example, outsourcing, right? So that would be explained under the phenomenon of globalization. India, for example, has captured well over 50% of the world's outsourcing market. Okay, well over 50%. And there's this huge debate taking place now as to whether that is going to diminish because of the fact that the businesses here are collapsing. Some people are saying, in fact, no, the outsourcing is going to get better because as businesses make less profit here, okay, they're likely, if they're not already outsourcing, to in fact do that now because that's going to help them to cut down their costs further. I was just speaking to somebody who's written a book on outsourcing in India, and that's exactly the argument that he was making, that in fact outsourcing to India has in fact actually gone up in the last couple of years, right? Okay, so this is sort of the kind of issues we're talking about, but I think we still need to get our grip on what is globalization and what is its politics. So let me take the two, I think Nishita, you had your hand up, right? Yeah. Okay, and you had your hand up, yeah.
An aspect of globalization, because the trade aspect went on around the turn of the 20th century as well.
Yes.
Trade vastly increased and things like that. But
yes.
increasingly, and partly due to the democratization of culture and technology, to a certain extent, the people with access to it see their identities have become global. They see themselves less as people in a locality or people in a nation, or as people on a global scale. And it affects the way they think about what their entitlements are and what they think about their access to certain ideas.
Okay. Okay. Well, in principle, I mean, I would say, yeah, that's a more subtle reading, but I don't know what a global identity means. I mean, I've heard that. That is, that people begin to think that their identities are more global, right? Has the attachment to the nation state diminished, for example, under conditions of globalization? I don't think so, right? So if you said that, well, globalization has some relationship to cosmopolitanism, right? That we've become more cosmopolitan, I'm not sure I would agree with that either, in fact, actually, right? I think that we think we have become a lot more cosmopolitan than we used to be, okay? But one of the books that I teach very often is a book set in 13th century India and the Arab world. It's called In an Antique Land. I'm going to recommend it very highly to you, okay? By Amitav Ghosh, who's a absolutely first-rate novelist and writer, cultural anthropologist. But this is a book called In an Antique Land.
And one of the things that he shows there is that if you look at the 13th century, right, in fact, it was in some respects a much more globalized world than we have at the present moment. Let me give you one illustration. I'm sure people could come up with a contrary illustration, but that's what we're doing. We're trying to set up a debate. Let me give you one illustration. So you're a businessman today, right? And you want to spread your trade, your goods, wherever you can. And typically the pattern in which you do it is you take a flight, fly business class if you can, go to Shanghai or Hong Kong or Delhi or wherever, spend the 24 or 36 hours that you need there, and then you're back in your own location, and maybe 2 days later you're taking another trip. And this one is to Nairobi, right? And then 3 days later it's another trip to Germany, right? Now, you're living in a globalized world, right? So you're moving back and forth between different places, right? But does that really make you, let's say, cosmopolitan, for example? Now, one of the interesting things that happened in the 13th century was that an Indian, you know, because the 13th century, by the way, was the world of the Indian Ocean trading system, right? I mean, the biggest trading networks in the world were located around the Indian Ocean, involved India, involved Southeast Asia, the east coast of Africa, the South China Sea, Aden, okay, places like that, right? So it's the Indian Ocean trading system, basically, a vast trading system. Now, you go from India, you take a boat, because that's the only way you would get, obviously, to a place like Singapore, for example, okay? Singapore, it doesn't figure really at that point, because Singapore is a British colonial city, but you go to Macau, let's say, okay? So you go there in the 13th century, you take a boat. Now, one of the things you have to think about is that the trader who goes there, okay, when he gets to Macau, he stays there for 4 months. One of the reasons he has to stay there for 4 months is that he is subjected to the constraints of the monsoon system, okay? That he cannot, for example, go there, you know, and leave the next month, because the next month the monsoon comes in, he settles down. And what Amitav Ghosh shows is that these were people who were leading truly bicultural lives. Truly bicultural lives. They're living, these people are actually living in a number of places at the same time, right? And very often marrying somebody from that community, from that local community. They're all highly multilingual, right? I think that's a very different world, right? You may have a lot more transactions today, you know, in lots of different countries. It's like academics, I mean, hopping off to conferences, you know, right? Okay, you know, one to another, you know, here and there, but there's no real interaction, if I may put it this way, right? There's no real interaction there, right? So what exactly globalization has done to human relationships, whether human relationships become more complex, less complex, those are the kinds of questions I'm submitting to you that we would have to really think about, okay? And so I want to make a number of suggestions, right? For us, and these are suggestions made from the point of view of what we've done in the class so far, right? So the first suggestion is that I think we have to ask ourselves, has globalization, okay, been to the benefit of India or not? And I don't mean that in a purely instrumental sense, that you can't simply do a cost-benefit analysis in the manner in which an economist might. And you could say, okay, these are the pros of globalization, these are the cons of globalization. To some extent, you may have to end up doing that, but not in a purely mechanical sense of the term. So the 100,000 farmers who have committed suicide, for example, right, okay, which we talked about in this class at some length, over the course of the last 10 to 12 years alone, right? 100,000, possibly more, okay? Now, how does one explain this, right? Does this have a specific relationship to globalization? And of course, my submission to you would be, it does. I think it unquestionably has a relationship, because I would maintain that agrarian distress has always been a part of the history of India. In fact, probably the history of any society which has had an agrarian economy, right? So I'm not trying to romanticize the Indian past and say that we never had agrarian distress. There was never a time when farmers were not really feeling the pinch, right? I think there always was agrarian distress. There was revolt in the countryside. There were taxes that were unjust very often, Okay? But I think the conditions under which these suicides are taking place today suggests that from the perspective of the peasant, okay, the conditions have become much worse than they ever have been before. Why? Lots of reasons. For one thing, the nature of agriculture all over the world. The United States is the best example of that, right? The nature of agriculture is to homogenize agriculture completely. That means you introduce mechanized farming, very large farms, okay, because the only way to make highly mechanized farming successful is to have larger farms, right? Introduce new breeds, and you grow for the market, for the overseas market very often. You grow for the overseas market. You do not grow for the subsistence economy. You do not grow for your local community any longer. Right? And that's what has been happening. We saw that with these farmers, the cotton farmers, okay, in Vidarbha, right, in Maharashtra, in Andhra Pradesh, in places like that. Right? Right? So I'm trying to suggest to you that it seems that globalization has certainly exacerbated some of the inequalities, right, that have always persisted, and that now it seems to me have become much worse. And in some ways, the social security net that you had for people, the social security net that you had for people may in fact be collapsing to some degree. Why is it collapsing to some degree, even in a country like India? Because the ethos of the private market has certainly come in a very big way. And again, I'm not suggesting, by the way, that the private, that the market and private trade, free trade, did not exist to some degree before in India, but I'm saying that these conditions have become highly exacerbated. The rate at which it is happening has accelerated to a very, very substantial degree. Okay? Right. I think there was a question there. Yes?
I'm curious, how do you distinguish, this notion of globalization increasing inequality in
Yeah.
rural groups? How do you distinguish that from trade agreements with the United States that would adversely affect its farmers?
I don't think I would. In other words, I would say that, I mean, that's an illustration, right? So if we're saying that if you look at trade agreements, okay, but we would have to say which trade agreement are we talking about? Are we talking about NAFTA, or are we talking about the WTO regime as a whole, right? Because by the way, the trade, if you look at farming in India and you look at the United States, I mean, one of the objections that has been made by the Indian government, okay, is the large subsidies given to farmers in the United States. I think you're probably aware of that, right? I mean, this is a dispute that India has had not just with the United States, but with the EU, with the European Union as well, right? Because in principle, we know that what the U.S. promotes is the idea of free trade, right? Well, if you have free trade, that also means, in general, that the state should not be giving subsidies, right? Right? But the U.S. has been doing that, right? And this is why there's been a strenuous objection to that. So the answer to the question is that we are looking at one particular strand. We are looking at a strand in India, but if you're looking at the United States and saying, well, is it the case that farmers here might have been adversely affected as well, right? That may well be the case. We'd have to really look at the data over there, and then we'd have to look at whether you're looking actually at agreements that have been signed between the United States and Mexico, or whether we're looking at agreements that have been signed between the United States and other countries.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Wasn't it they just had a string of agreements with related to nuclear technology in the United States and India sharing nuclear technology?
You're absolutely right.
Right.
Absolutely right.
Wasn't there also an agreement paired to that regarding agricultural trade?
No, because that's part of Doha. That's the Doha round of agreements of WTO, and that is actually at a stalemate at the present moment. Yeah. There's a stalemate. In fact, the country that has basically created the stalemate in part is India. I mean, there are other countries as well, and they've created a stalemate precisely because they feel that the conditions under which global agriculture is conducted today are highly uneven and unjust. Right? But the very fact that we can use a phrase called global agriculture suggests what has really transformed, right? Because agriculture meant you grew for your local community in the first place. Subsistence economy. Crop rotation was very common. I mean, one of the problems that has happened in places like Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh, where you've had these farmer suicides, is that these farmers are no longer practicing crop rotation. Now, when you do not practice crop rotation, it also leads to depletion of the soil. Okay? And one of the reasons you do not practice crop rotation is because you're producing for a global market. So you produce a cash crop, right? So cotton would be, in this case, a cash crop, right? So these are the kinds of problems that we're talking about. But let's take another illustration. One of the definitions that was initially offered in the class today for globalization was globalization is the exchange of services and goods, okay, at an accelerated rate. What about people, by the way? Right? I mean, is it not the case that globalization means that, yes, countries trade at an accelerated rate. You send goods, and then you've got exchange of services. Outsourcing would be an illustration of that. But it seems to me that the restrictions that have been placed on the movement of people, okay, have in fact actually greatly increased, right? The visa and passport regimes that have been installed in most countries make the movement of people from one country to another very difficult, right? Particularly for purposes of immigration. Yes.
Would you say nationalism as a whole has also increased?
I would say so, yeah. But I think, but you see, this is where the contradictions come in, because globalization is supposed to lead us, right, to a world where the nation state is no longer the sole focus of our loyalty and attachment, right? That was my first remark when, one of my first remarks today was, okay, but if we're thinking about globalization increasing, things like the exchange of ideas and so forth, well, if that's happening, then why is it that the attachment to the nation state remains so strong, right? Why does it remain so strong? I mean, it is estimated that there are roughly about 500 million people in the world today, 500 million people in the world today who have moved in recent years. I don't mean move from San Fernando Valley to Westwood, of course. I mean moved from one nation state to another, or moved from one district to another involuntarily because they have become internally displaced people. The Swath Valley, okay, where, as you know, there is now a conflict going on, where the Pakistani army, under pressure from the US, is trying to drive out something called the Taliban. I say something called the Taliban because, frankly, no one has the slightest clue who these Taliban are. I mean, I was just at a conference 3 days ago about Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Taliban, and there are 40 different groups, under this rubric called the Taliban, right? But we know that in the Swath Valley, 2 million people have been displaced in the last 3 weeks alone, okay? Right, so these are what are called IDPs, internally displaced people. Now, globalization says it's perfectly fine for the US to send all of its goods, right, wherever it wants. China can send its goods wherever, but please, we don't want any Chinese coming, or we don't want any people from Sudan coming, right? This is what I mean. What are the restrictions? That is that freedom there is no unhindered access across borders, right, possible under globalization. It's only possible for goods, not for people. So therefore, the question for us is going to be, right, what kind of globalized world are we talking about, right, and what does it really mean for India? Now, I want to leave that question aside for the moment, move to the next question, because what I'm going to do in my concluding remarks on Thursday is I'm going to try to wrap it up for you, right? But let's look at some other elements of the discussion here, because recall what I'm saying to you, that what we're trying to do is we're trying to assess, okay, where does India stand at the present moment? What is its relationship to the world, right? What are the kinds of questions that are important for Indians to think about, right? And I want to turn our attention for a moment to 1998, to India's nuclear explosions. Now, before we get into a discussion of these India's nuclear explosions, because the logical question to ask, of course, is, why is it that India wanted to enter the nuclear club, right? Which is, in my view, a debased club. When I say debased, I mean that I think it's absurd that any country should have nuclear weapons, and why any other country should clamor to join in is, I think, a question that we have to seriously ask. Okay? And of course I know, I mean, when I say why, I mean rhetorically, because of course, I mean, a political scientist will come along and say, well, we need it for deterrence. We need it for deterrence against China or Pakistan, right? Whatever the case may be, that this is the logic of the nation state. When you are in the nation state system, right, There is no other logic that's possible. You have to defend yourself. Right? Okay, and then of course we know exactly what the questions are, what the objections will be on the other side. You know, that all the money that went into the nuclear programs, well, maybe some of it should have gone into feeding more people in India. Maybe the number of malnutrition people in India would diminish at least by 1% or 2% or 5%. You know, why is it that after 60 years of independence, less than 30% of the population of the country has access to safe drinking water? That seems to be a pretty basic right? Less than 30%. And so clearly, if I'm saying that you could look at this debate, and I think it's very clear what the arguments would be on both sides. The question then would be, is there anything else that we can add to this debate? Right? Can we look at it perhaps from a slightly different angle? Are there other kinds of anxieties? So to understand that, let's just go back for a moment to the 1960s and 1970s. Now in 1965, India and Pakistan fought a war with each other. They fought it to a standstill, you might say. It's not clear that there's a real victor there. If you read the Pakistani history textbooks, they tell you that Pakistan won a glorious victory, which is about as credible as any other preposterous proposition that you could have heard. If you read the Indian side of the story, they'll say that pretty much the same, although I think in India there's, I would say, a more clear recognition, and partly it has to do with the level of confidence. You know, when the level of confidence is higher, you have to utter fewer lies, if I may put it this way. Right? So I think in India there is some recognition that essentially this war was really fought to a standstill, although some people say that India won a decisive military victory. The point here is this, that you can, in a way, settle this by looking at what India sought to do in the years after 1965. One of the things it sought to do was to develop a nuclear program. Okay? And I think that that's a very clear indication of the fact that it sought to achieve some kind of military supremacy in South Asia. Okay? It sought to achieve some kind of military supremacy in South Asia, which is an indication that 1965 was not, in fact, a decisive military victory, but was, in fact, actually a battle that was a war that was fought to a standstill. You know, okay. So the way it sought to do it was to develop a nuclear program, and in fact, at a place called Pokhran, okay, Pokhran, which is a place in the desert in Western India. India actually conducted a test. They exploded what was called a peaceful nuclear device. Can you believe that? By the way, this is not my language. I didn't invent this. This is what it was called. They exploded a peaceful nuclear device. This is the official language. Okay? And the idea was that, well, India is not really conducting an atomic test because, in fact, they didn't have an atomic bomb at that point in time. The idea was that this was in fact intended to generate more information about nuclear energy, okay, about the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, and this can be used not simply for the kinds of things that we use for, such as, you know, for example, generation of electricity eventually through nuclear plants, but also for a satellite tracking of districts in India where you could then make better predictions, okay, about rainfall, okay, and therefore that might have an effect on agriculture. Right? These are the kinds of arguments that were used, and one of the reasons why India called this a peaceful nuclear device, okay, is because there was still an enormous amount of guilt, if I may put it this way, that a country that had fathered the idea of a mass non-violent resistance movement to colonial rule under the leadership of Mohandas Gandhi, right, that this country was now going the same path that countries such as the United States and the Soviet Union had gone. Okay? So this is the context that you have to keep in mind, right? What I'm suggesting to you is that, number one, in order to understand what happened in 1998, when India does actually conduct nuclear tests, and shows to the world that it has the atomic bomb, that long before this India had been playing around with this, okay? But in 1973, when it actually did this peaceful nuclear device, exploded this peaceful nuclear device, there was still some guilt. There was still a considerable amount of restraint. There was this ambiguity. And of course, India didn't really want to know, want the rest of the world to know what exactly were its capabilities in the nuclear sector. Right? So you sort of keep this not simply hidden, but you keep it at a level of ambiguity, as I'm describing. Right? And this is what led Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was the prime minister of Bhutan, to say, Pakistan, to say that Pakistan will be prepared to eat grass if it has to, but it will catch up with India. Okay? And this is a comment that he makes, that we are prepared to eat grass, reduce ourselves, right? But we will definitely catch up with India. Right? So keep that in mind now. The other thing you have to keep in mind was the fact that China was becoming a nuclear power around this point in time. Okay, and this is when China would eventually then enter the, the diplomatic relations between China and the United States commenced with Nixon, right, with the opening up of China, right? So there's a larger geopolitics. This is the geopolitics that's informing it. India understands very well that if you want to gain respect in this world, okay, you need to be able to exercise your muscle power. And the best way that you can show the world that you have some degree of muscle power is you have the bomb, right? So this is the situation that you get in the mid-1970s. Now there was considerable internal turmoil in India, as we've already talked about it, right? In the mid-1970s, 1977. Remember that Indira Gandhi in 1975 was also going to impose an emergency, right? And in 1977, she was going to lose the election. A new government comes into power, a non-Congress government for the first time from 1977 to 1980. And then Indira Gandhi is going to assume power again in 1980. But you're going to have an insurrection. And this is the insurrection that takes place in the Punjab. Right? You're going to begin to have some amount of insurrectionary activity in Kashmir. And you've had insurrectionary activity in Northeast India for already 3 decades at this point in time. Right? So this was not the time, if I may put it this way, for India to launch into a full-scale expansion of its nuclear program. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Hindu nationalists so far are still submerged. They're still submerged, right? Because as was mentioned in class by Nikhil before, that after the assassination of Gandhi in 1948, essentially the Hindu nationalists go into hibernation. Right? They go into hibernation, and they're going to resurface in the late 1970s, early 1980s. They're going to start to resurface. Right? They're going to start to resurface. Now, it is going to be that period of time, in the 1980s, when the question of accelerating India's nuclear program is going to pick up again. It's going to pick up again. Right? And it is going to be the BJP, which is going to come into power in 1998, which is, in fact, going to conduct India's first full nuclear tests. Right? So it's a Hindu nationalist party that does it. It's not the Congress party that does it. It's the Hindu nationalist party in power at the time when India decides to conduct its nuclear tests. Right? And the question here is, all right, so what is the message that is being sent? Who is the message being sent to? Right? And if you read the piece that I've written, you know that one of the arguments that I make that is that, I mean, in part, this is a demonstration of what I'm calling the culture of masculinity. Right? That if you're going to be part of the nation-state system, okay, India's a nation-state, there's a nation-state system, right? And even the United Nations, by the way, which some people mistakenly view as beyond the nation-state system, in fact, is 100% predicated on the nation-state system, because the constituent elements of the United Nations are the nation-states, right? Okay, with varying degrees of power. So the ones that are the most powerful, obviously have a much greater weight and influence than the ones that are the least powerful. Right? I mean, in principle, that's not how it's supposed to be, because the General Assembly of the United Nations gives one vote to each nation state. Doesn't matter whether you're Zaire, or Zambia, or the United States. Right? But we know that one of the things that's happened in the United Nations system is that the General Assembly has become pretty much obsolete over the course of the last 3 decades. Right? It's a Security Council that makes all the key decisions, and there, of course, the 5 countries with the veto power, right, have all the say. Right? In fact, one of India's greatest ambitions, this is what I mean here by the Security Council here, by the way, one of India's greatest ambitions at the present moment, right, is to become a permanent member of the Security Council. There's a campaign that has been going on in India for the last 5 years to try to make sure that the rules of the United Nations are bent at some point, right, and transformed so that India can then become a member of the Security Council. And there are, of course, a great many people who object to that. Pakistan, of course, objects, viciously, if I may put it this way, and vociferously would be the better word, right, rigorously to that for obvious reasons. Right? They don't want to see India have a seat as a permanent member of the Security Council. And of course, the countries that state that, well, how can a country which has the largest number of malnourished people in the world, the largest rates of illiteracy, etc., how can a country like that be a permanent member of the Security Council? Right? Okay? But the key thing here is this, right? That 1998, India conducts these nuclear tests. And some people have argued that it was in fact actually a strategic mistake to do that, because whatever military supremacy India may have had in conventional war, okay, over Pakistan, and I think there's no question that in terms of conventional war, India would have had military supremacy over Pakistan. That whatever military supremacy it had was wiped out with the nuclear tests of 1998, because when Pakistan tested a couple of weeks later, right, and showed to the world that, well, it has the atomic bomb too, basically now the situation was that India could no longer afford to take the risk of conducting a war with Pakistan. Right? And part of the reason why you can't take a risk is because it is very well understood that politics does not have everything to do with rationality, that all the actors who are involved in politics do not always behave rationally. Right? If you were behaving rationally, you would say to yourself, well, under no circumstances can one ever use an atomic bomb, because it's just going to wipe out huge populations. Right? But we know that, in fact, rationality is not the only determinative criteria of how people engage in political life. Okay? And so one of the things that I'm trying to suggest in that piece that I wrote, which you've read, is that if you look at the nuclear tests, right, I think that one has to start looking at different elements of the story now. Right? The usual elements of the story coming from the point of view of those who are objecting to it are the elements that I mentioned to you before, such as the fact that, well, all of this money is being squandered on these programs. It's much better that if we spent the money on infrastructure in India, on improving drinking water facilities, etc., etc. And by the way, I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I'm saying that in a sense that's a very predictable kind of reading. Right? What I'm trying to suggest here is that, number one, let's try to understand what is the cultural politics of the bomb. Okay? What is the cultural politics? What kind of message is being sent to whom? And I found it extraordinarily interesting that when the bomb was exploded in 1998, okay, Bal Thackeray. So Bal Thackeray, who is Bal Thackeray? He is the leader of a political party called the Shiv Sena. I don't think I've actually mentioned it in this class before. Okay, so the Shiv Sena is a political party which is active in Maharashtra, and most particularly in the city of Bombay. Okay, I would describe it as a political party comprised largely of goons and hooligans. Okay, hoodlums, small-time hoodlums, the majority of them. Bal Thackeray has been their leader for a very long period of time. Open admirer of Hitler, by the way. Right? He thinks that India should, in fact, do to the Muslims what the Nazis did to the Jews. And I mean, he'll say that openly. This is the only way to deal with the Muslims. Right? They don't understand any other language, he'll say. Right? I mean, of course, there are other times when he'll take a very different view and he'll say, oh, Muslims, they're just like us. They're all part of India. I mean, they can live here so long as they accept some of our customs. Right? So why do I bring him in? Because when the nuclear test took place, his first comment was, I'll say it in the Hindi first, and then I'll translate for you. हमने उनको दिखा दिए हम हिजड़े नहीं हैं. We have shown to them that we are not eunuchs. Okay? We are not castrated people. I mean, that's significant. Right? And who is the them, by the way, right? Who is the them? You could say, by the way, that it's Pakistan. I'm not sure it's only Pakistan. I think it's, in fact, Muslims in India too. In fact, I think it's also the United States saying that, hey, don't think that you can ride roughshod over India because we are a nuclear power now. Right? But we assure them we are not eunuchs. And of course, by the way, this is a deliberate attack on Gandhi, because Gandhi was viewed as somebody who had compromised his masculinity, right, and had embraced far too much of femininity. Right? I mean, so this is what I mean when I say there is a cultural politics. Right? And so we have to understand that the explosions have to be condemned. But that's my view, and somebody here might say, well, actually, you know, this is how the nation-state system works, as I said before, and India needs it. India needs it. If India doesn't have it, well, you know, India opens itself up to attack. Okay, right? It's defenseless, so forth and so on. Somebody could make a kind of a realpolitik view of that kind. I mean, right? But my view is that in having exploded these nuclear bombs, India did a number of things. First, it essentially became a completely captive to the ideology of the nation state. Okay, completely captive to the ideology of the nation state. And recall that one of the things that I've been talking about in this class consistently, right, is the tension between the idea of India as a nation state and India as a civilization. Right? Because I've been trying to suggest to you that there are other ways in which one tries to comprehend one's place in the world. There are other ways of having interpersonal relationships with, okay, right? That it's not simply the zero-sum politics of the nation-state system, right? That one group of people benefit at the cost of others, right? That's a zero-sum game that we're talking about here, right? And so what I'm suggesting is that India basically became essentially captive to the nation-state system, meaning that India essentially gives up on the idea that as a civilization it means something very different than what it means as a nation state, right? And secondly, it is sending a direct message, right, of assertion of its regional power status and its aspirations to be a world power, right? So this is the sort of thing that China did. I mean, and China here was really only doing what Kissinger and Nixon had already proclaimed in the early 1970s, that if a country really wanted to be heard around the world, it had to explode a nuclear bomb, right? I mean, this is exactly what Kissinger says in the early 1970s, and this is exactly what China then seeks to do. It becomes a nuclear power, right? So you need to be heard around the world, and one of the ways in which you get heard around the world is you join the nuclear club. Okay? So this is the kind of politics. I'm not spelling out all the elements because the other elements of that are in the piece that I've written, and some of them are in the piece that Amartya Sen has written, which is the other piece that you've actually read on the bomb for this week. But this is how I would locate the cultural politics of nuclearism. Okay? And then we're going to have to tie in, which is what I'm going to do on Thursday. I'm going to tie it, I think you can already see where I'm going, with what I'm describing as an anxiety of influence. Right? So in my concluding remarks, what I want to suggest to you is that on the one hand, it seems to me that if you're looking at India in 2009, there is a kind of anxiety of influence. I'll explain what it means. Okay? But at the same time, it seems to me that there is, in fact, a kind of a confidence, a growing confidence in this country, which I think is quite remarkable today. Yeah. Okay? So we're going to end over here. If there are people who have not, students who have not picked up their papers, which is true of several of you, you have another chance to do it today. Okay, I have the papers with me.